Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber post a comment and sort of a question combination that I'm going to flip in here. They wanting to know, hey, maybe vegans are right about calories not mattering if you're eating almost all carbs and almost no fat. And what about all these rock stars and people, again, the guys from Guns N' Roses claim they were drinking a gallon of vodka every day for years straight. That's like 8,000 calories of alcohol. What's going on here? Let's talk about some of this. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, see if I can skill up my crafting a little bit. And yeah, let's talk about this. All right. I've talked a bit in the past about that vegans are partially correct about the carb thing. Now, if you eat unlimited amounts of carbohydrates and a very low-fat diet, you'll still gain fat, but you will gain fat slower than if you eat more fat in your diet. I mean, that's just, we understand that from the way calories in, calories out work, the way nutrient partitioning works, thermic effect. Carbohydrates are actually not really fattening in humans unless you are really insulin resistant. There are problems with certain sedentary obese people who will store carbs as fat easily, but most humans really don't. So it comes down to the dietary fat you're eating while you burn the carbohydrates. You tend to store them as glucose, liver glucose, and burn them off as extra body heat. But the problem at the end of the day is that, yeah, they will kick up your energy out, but ultimately they'll make you store the fat you eat. You can't get away with eating excessively low fat to the point to where you couldn't gain body fat because you'll have other health problems. So it's not an option, but will you gain less body fat? Yeah, a lot less. That's just the reality of it, but you'll still gain fat. But they are partially right there. I'm not going to argue with them on that. They're partially correct. But this idea that you could eat unlimited calories, mind-boggling amounts of just all carb calories and lose body fat all the time, that's not so true. It just makes it more difficult to gain fat with what they're talking about. Now, the alcohol thing is a whole nother issue. Alcohol isn't that fattening in certain ways. Alcohol is kind of a tricky macronutrient because it has a totally different thermic effect in the body, and it tends to have a really high and dynamic thermic effect. So yeah, you tend to burn off alcohol. You tend to burn alcohol first as a fuel source when it's available. You tend to burn it off as body heat very, very quickly. So you waste a lot of alcohol calories themselves if you're drinking large amounts of alcohol. The problem we get into, though, is that you're talking about anecdote and oftentimes exaggerations from singers and rock stars who are drunk all the time, who are high all the time, and they aren't weighing and tracking what they're eating day to day. So oftentimes they tell these stories as almost legendary stories, but it's like, did they really drink a gallon of vodka every day? Is this per person? Is this spread around the group? Are there groupies drinking some of the gallon? Did they actually track this, or were they just get drunk every night and get all fucked up and high every night and not actually know? That's the problem we run into with anecdotes. It's one thing for people to talk about their anecdotal behavior, what all they eat. But when that doesn't match what we know in labs happens, and maybe you have to consider that had you put them in a lab, the numbers would have been different. That when someone's actually tracking it for them and monitoring them 24 hours a day, you come up with a little different numbers than when people give their personal anecdotes of what they claim they did. And that's the difference there. You know, people are notorious for inaccurately tracking this stuff. I mean, we've actually had studies in certain environments, and I've talked about this before, where perfectly sober, otherwise sane people, when they're put on cameras and you monitor them 24/7, oftentimes miss their caloric tracking, what they write down and schedule and weigh and everything else. They miss it by over 1,000 calories sometimes. And that's why self-reported data isn't that useful. That's another reason I tell people even tracking your macros religiously gets kind of silly, on top of the fact that you can't even track them accurately. Humans, particularly in a caloric deficit, are notorious for mistracking their calories. People who are prone to obesity, when they're overeating, they try to track their calories. They tend to miss them by massive amounts. Like, people are terrible at tracking their own calories with self-reported intakes. We know this from studies. We've actually studied that fact and found that humans really suck at that. Undereaters will add thousands of extra calories to their diet they didn't actually eat and be convinced they ate them. And overeaters will do the opposite. They'll mark way less calories than they actually ate when you actually track them and follow them with cameras to see what they're actually eating. And people convince themselves of this. That's just the nature of it, even people measuring things. So then when it comes to drugs and alcohol in the mix, that just throws a whole nother mixture into the equation, particularly against celebrities who are bragging about things. So the idea that each of these guys drank 8,000 calories of alcohol every day for years straight and didn't get fat, I mean, just think about it from that perspective. People can't even accurately track their caloric intake most of the time when they're sober. What makes you think guys who are drunk and fucked up every night and using drugs are going to be able to track it? On top of that, you do have to factor in that a lot of these guys use a lot of stimulant type drugs that actually speed up metabolism and reduce appetite. Cocaine, crystal meth, all of these things, which incidentally are also used by many pre-contest bodybuilders. So you factor in all the cocaine and everything else involved in their lifestyles that would suppress appetite, speed up metabolism, with the fact that you don't really know how much alcohol they're drinking. Maybe they aren't eating a whole lot of real food. Maybe they're only eating one meal a day outside of all the vodka they were drinking. So ultimately, you might find their total caloric intake might have been a lot lower than you thought. And you need to also remember alcohol calories are going to be far more thermic than we often account for, burning them off as body heat. So again, personal anecdotes of the alcohol are really hard to measure. And the thing is, ultimately, it is very difficult to track the caloric intake of alcohol just because of the bizarre thermic effect in the body. It's one of those things that is very, very difficult to track and add into your calories and your macros in general. If you were trying to track them, it's a big oddball that will really mess with it. But it is very non-fattening. But by that same token, excessive alcohol intake can also cause fatty liver, just like excessive fructose intake does, through the same pathways, which could ultimately long-term lead to more obesity, because fatty liver tends to lead to insulin resistance. Insulin resistance will tend to lead to obesity in the long term. Of course, being obese can also affect insulin resistance, and they kind of feed into each other negatively. So you just can't take anecdotes like this seriously. But back to the other point, as far as carbohydrates and alcohol both go, the more of them you consume, oftentimes the higher their thermic effect. The more of them you consume, the more of them you're burning for fuel, though, and the more you will store the other things that you eat. And ultimately, yeah, you can manipulate these things to gain less body fat, but you're not going to manipulate these things enough to where you can way overeat and not gain any body fat at all. So that's the point that you always need to come back to when vegans make this claim. They're partially right. And I don't want people to think that I'm saying, oh, they're wrong, they're stupid or anything. They aren't. They're partially correct. And that is backed by the science. Low-fat, high-carb diets are less fattening calorie per calorie. But overeating is still going to be fattening. If you're chronically overeating every single day, you are going to gain body fat irrespective of the composition of your diet unless certain drugs come into the mix. And that's a totally different argument. That's something I talked about quite a bit, I believe, in the Trenbolone video, which you guys can check out. It's very long, though. But barring drugs coming into the equation that affect certain pathways in the body, any caloric excess is going to equal body fat gain eventually. Sometimes it might take several days for it to start happening, but it will happen eventually, no matter what. It's just a matter of how much body fat you're gaining from the caloric excess. That's ultimately what we're talking about. And yeah, a very high carbohydrate, low fat diet is less fattening calorie per calorie on the overfeeding side, but you're still going to gain some body fat. But yeah, you can't get around the laws of thermodynamics. Your body has to get energy from somewhere. Once energy is put in the body, it has to go somewhere. It has to do something. And again, it's not to say that certain things can't be burned off as extra body heat, because you can increase your calories out by consuming large amounts of carbohydrates. You can speed up your thyroid function by consuming large amounts of carbohydrates. I mean, you can tweak the thermodynamics a bit, but you're not breaking the laws of thermodynamics by doing so. You're still working within the laws of thermodynamics. I mean, you can create systems in your body by doing this, and that's what the really high carbohydrate overfeeding is, to where your body wastes calories inefficiently. It wastes heat inefficiently. You can totally do that, and that's what the vegans are talking about when they say this, but you're still going to store a bunch of the dietary fat that you eat, and you can only take your dietary fat so low before too low of a dietary fat starts to become a health risk and a health issue for you. So, I mean, ultimately, while you can manipulate it to gain less fat when overeating, if you are continually overeating, there's no way to avoid gaining at least a little bit of body fat. But the point still holds true that if you are going to overeat, In particular, this becomes useful for guys on a bulk. If you are going to overeat, keep your dietary fat as low as you can get away with without your energy plummeting, without your hormones plummeting, without developing dietary deficiencies, and you probably will gain less body fat on your bulks. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.